Okay, welcome to Landscape for Life. This is a program put together by the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center and the U.S. Botanic Garden. And here in this area, we present it through Loudon Wildlife Conservancy, which is a really great organization if you're not already familiar with them. So we're volunteers with Loudon Wildlife, and they do a lot of great events, from bird watching to nature hikes to things for children, getting children outside, lots of good lectures, and then this involvement in the native plants. So just a little bit where we're coming from. I'm Nan McCarry. This is my yard, probably a bigger one than most of you are dealing with. And this is, I'm going towards trees and meadow here in my yard. And this is BJ Lecrone's yard. She's the other speaker today. And as you can see, she has taken a large part of her lawn and field and converted it into meadow with the paths there. So she's supporting a lot of wildlife with her wildflowers there. So just a little bit about how we got here. So here's a picture of from 1957 of the kind of landscape that we had. And as we know, it now looks more like this, but this is 2013. So might have even been changes since then. And there's not much here in the way of supporting our wildlife and protecting our soils and our water, which is another big part of this presentation. And I experienced this in my own life. The little house I grew up in is now gone. It was under sort of by that tree there, and now there's a subdivision there. So this, we can mourn this, and this is kind of a difficult thing. But the good news is you can make a difference, starting right in your own yard. So first, I'm going to give a definition of sustainability, because a lot of people use that word in a lot of different ways. I actually think of three things when I think of sustainability. One is just using wisely today to leave resources for future generations, and thinking about cycles. So in nature, the waste from one organism is food for another organism. Something evolves to take that niche to use that food. So keeping your resources in a cycle as much as possible. And kind of along with this, thinking about where our inputs come from and our outputs go, or the total impact that we have. So even if we're doing sustainable gardening in our home, if we have a lot of stuff going out to the landfill, then that's causing problems for the larger ecosystem. And also thinking about where things come from that we use in our yard, such as bringing in fossil fuels to operate things in our yard. So just thinking that way. So a sustainable garden, we actually have a very specific definition of that for Landscape for Life. So here's an example of a sustainable garden. Anything jump to mind that people can notice about this that might make it sustainable? If not, that's okay.
Using native plants that are accustomed to like the rainfall and soils in the area.
Yep, that's right. This woman, Ann Garvey, filled her yard with native plants. She gave up some of the large parts of the lawn actually to convert it to native plants. We also see that instead of lawn, we have some mulch here and a few stepping stones instead of a large paved area. And that means that water can seep down into the soil and get cleaned by the microorganisms. So very specifically, a sustainable garden fosters nature's ability to provide ecosystem services. And we're going to talk a lot about ecosystem services. We see one represented here, which is that we eat what nature provides. Here's human food on the left and food for wildlife there on the right. So that's one of the ecosystem services that nature provides, is food. Ecosystem services is basically just the stuff nature does for us for free. And we want to mimic how nature provides these services and foster nature's ability to provide them. So making our gardens in the way that maximizes ecosystem services rather than minimizes it as much of our traditional gardening has done. So one ecosystem service is capturing and cleaning water. Nature does a good job of cleaning our water, and it actually costs our municipalities money to clean our water. We want water to slow down and sink in. Plants and especially trees control erosion and sediment runoff. That's another ecosystem service. Building healthy and fertile soil, really important ecosystem service. I just like seeing logs rotting in the woods like this, and it's kind of fun to see how they turn back into the soil by the action of the soil food web, including the microscopic parts of it. So as we know, nature takes dead leaves and bark and builds healthy, fertile soil. Providing clean air and sequestering carbon is another ecosystem service. And so we want to get our carbon out of the air and into plants, especially trees, and get it down into the ground where it should be stored. Trees also are able to clean our air through their leaves. They're able to catch particulates and actually clean the air. And of course, they give off oxygen. Mitigating the urban heat island is another ecosystem service. And the closer we get to the city, the more this is an impact. But I think we all can tell the difference between on a hot summer day when you have asphalt versus greenery around you, just how much the urban heat island is mitigated. And supporting human health and well-being. As we know, nature is good for children and good for adults too. And providing habitat. So we're going to talk about this ecosystem service quite a bit down the road. Who knows what plant this is? Anybody? Yeah?
Milkweed?
Yes, thank you. So this is milkweed, which is famous now for supporting monarch caterpillars. Here we see a bee on it, so the nectar and pollen also is good. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the unsustainable versus sustainable way to do things in the garden. And we're going to go through soil and water and plants, and then talk a little bit about wildlife. So soil. In an unsustainable landscape, we often have compacted soil that's the topsoil is removed and equipment and overuse has caused it to compact. So clay soil, which we have here, naturally compacts easily when you put a force on it. So you want to try to not have forces on your soil, because that, like running your lawnmower over it, because that just compacts it more. In a sustainable landscape, the soil is a living, healthy ecosystem. Here we see that the leaves would be decomposed. We see this mushroom, which represents an entire network of underground mycorrhizae, we call it, which are these relationships between fungi and the roots of plants, which is a very important component now. So in general, we think of the soil as living. So carbon dioxide and solar energy are what fuel plants. And then when, like, the leaves drop off of this tree, everything's used in this food web in a different part of the food web, so that, you know, the bigger guys eat the littler guys. And every time a critter eats something else, it incorporates those nutrients into its body. So when that little critter dies, then that means those nutrients are available for your plants. So this is the way to keep nutrients in the soil where we want them for our plants. So in an unsustainable landscape, garden clippings are often disposed of off-site in a landfill. Again, this is taking things off the site that we could instead just keep on the site if composting is allowing something to basically return to the soil, and if you have room for that. Just garden clippings from your lawn in general, all of these things can support the soil food web and support healthy vegetation. In an unsustainable landscape, we use fertilizers, industrially produced fertilizers. And in a sustainable landscape, we use the natural soil food web and on-site organic matter to promote healthy plant growth. And we also choose plants that are adapted to the site so that we don't need to use those inputs. So just a little bit more about compacted soils, which I touched on. I'm sure many of us who's dealt with compacted soils before, yeah, many of us. So you need pore spaces in your soil for water and air to be in there, as well as the mineral and organic components. And the way to mitigate compacted soils is, once again, to support the soil food web. Kind of a long-term process. One thing that works really well that many of us like to do is adding chopped up leaf mulch, which you can get at Loudon Milling and in Abernathy and Spencer in Lincoln. And the earthworms do a really good job of pulling that down into the soil and then starting to make those pore spaces and change the texture of the soil and provide food for everything down there. So that's one thing you can do. In general, adding organic matter is the answer. Just a slide to illustrate the importance of deep roots. This is actually a picture showing prairie plants in prairie soil, but we do have many of these plants for sale around here, same native plants, but you can see that the roots are so long that they had to be tied up, yeah, in sort of a ponytail. This was a display at the US Botanic Garden some years ago that I just really liked. So most of us don't have plant roots like this, but we want to think about our roots as doing that job. And then when they die, they decompose in the soil, adding more food. Okay, so talking about water. In an unsustainable landscape, we treat stormwater as a waste product and remove it quickly from the property. In a sustainable landscape, we treat all water as a resource and manage it on site because we want that water for our plants, right? So we want to keep it in the ground, not having it run off the top. As we know, there's more and more flooding like this. This kind of flooding is caused because there's just so much what we call impervious surface anymore, so that rainwater can't sink into vegetative soil. Instead, there's asphalt and lawns, and so you just get more and more runoff till the streams overflow. So this is a really nice description of the difference in how much infiltration you get from 3 inches of rain for different landscapes. So over here we have an impervious surface. Again, is surface that water can't percolate through. So think like asphalt is an impervious surface. So in the woods and in meadows, we get 2.4 inches infiltrating from the 3-inch rain, and only a 1/2 inch runs off. In row crop agriculture, it's 1 inch of runoff and 2 inches infiltrates. In the residential lots that many of us live in, it's about 1/2 and 1/2. And then as we get to the urban districts, of course, it runs off and there's just a 1/2 inch of infiltration. And cities are doing a better and better job with this, as we can see with the green spaces and the bioswales that they're putting in. Oh, just one of the many pollutants that washes off your yard into the streams, which is really bad for water quality, is animal waste. So we want to be aware of picking up after our pets. So the Chesapeake Bay is greatly affected by what happens in your lawn. And this is just showing siltation after a rain event. And that comes from all the both agriculture and lawns that are so much of the landscape of the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. As we probably know, there's a dead zone in the Chesapeake, and this is caused by the excess sediment that runs off, and also the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus, and these are called nutrients because they're good for our plants. We want them for our plants. When they get into the waterways, they're actually pollutants, but we're still calling them nutrients. And that's because they cause the overgrowth of algae. When the algae dies, it uses up the oxygen, so the fish and everybody doesn't have oxygenated water. So those nitrogen and phosphorus comes from lawns and from agriculture. And one study estimated that turfgrass is the 4th largest irrigated crop in the country and the biggest crop in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we basically need to think of our lawns as crops that we're growing. However, unlike with farmers, we're not really producing anything with that crop. And it takes a lot of inputs to make that crop, a lot of water and fertilizer. Once again, thinking about deep roots, this is a diagram of prairie plants. Again, some of the same native plants that we sell around here. Just want you to compare all of these with this one on the end here. This is Kentucky bluegrass. And this is just showing how much your lawn grass serves as an ecosystem service versus these, because there's very short roots here, which do very little to help build the soil and hold the soil in place. And the shorter you cut your lawn, the shorter the roots end up being. You might not even need fertilizer on your lawn. It turns out you don't have to get too involved in the details here. This is the basic at 7 here. As you can see, the nutrients that your plants need, the major ones are available there. As we get over here into more acidic soil, the nutrient might still be in your soil, but it's not available to your plant. It's not dissolved in the water that your plant roots can take up. So a lot of times people are throwing fertilizer on their lawn and they don't even need the fertilizer. So we really recommend that homeowners get a soil test before adding any fertilizer. So about managing stormwater, as we know, nowadays we have things like bioswales instead of just getting rid of the water. And then in the home area, we have rain gardens. Anybody have a rain garden by chance? Or so this is just an area where there's runoff from the house, such as coming off of this gutter, and you put deeply rooted plants that will absorb the rainwater and keep it in place, rather than, again, having it just run off the surface of the grass. There's a lot of information on the internet about how to properly make a rain garden. I actually made one that wasn't by the book. I don't know if I recommend that strategy, but it does direct the water. So yeah, you can get professional help with putting in a rain garden if you have an area that gathers some water. And here's something that a municipality in Minnesota did. So this is a rain garden that serves for many houses on the street or for the neighborhood, because you can see here where the curb is cut away. That's so that rainwater can run off of the street, carrying lots of pollutants that are on the roads, and go into a rain garden, and there be cleaned by the soil food web, because those critters in the soil will actually metabolize those things that are pollutants. And locally, we have this example of a riparian buffer, which is a way to slow down when you have a rainstorm, to slow down the raindrops from hitting the soil, and to have the roots, again, allow the water to seep into the soil so that it all doesn't run into the waterway right away. This was done by John McGee, and this is at Tippecanoe Lake. Stop me if you have any questions.
Is that right at the National Village?
Yes, it is. There's 3 lakes that he did there that are just fabulous. Compare them to the pond that we have here, Crittenden, where it's just, you see the water that runs into the pond there, because there's nothing there
So the
soak up
buffer
the
is
rain.
just all of the vegetation that's in front of,
Mhm.
so when we like to see, like here, I can just see everything.
just
It's
running
not
in.
exactly the best.
Right, that, yeah, I know our eyes start to like those
Yeah.
landscapes that are not quite as healthy. And then it also allows the geese to walk back and forth, and then all of their waste is a pollutant as well.
Because geese don't like that. What's
Oh,
it?
okay.
They don't like riparian buffers.
They don't like to
So,
walk through that, yeah.
Mhm.
So we have some native plants here. We have some ironweed. Yeah, some ironweed and some Amsonia over here, and a red cedar.
And buttonbush.
Oh, and buttonbush, yeah. Yeah, this is another place at, also at Tippecanoe Lake. And so we have this beautiful array of mountain mint, which is just adored by the bees. And this is orange milkweed, which is a beautiful milkweed in the summer and has these pods. That's Joe Pye weed down there. So
And this is an Ashburn Village.
Mhm.
okay, and so now let's get to another aspect of water, which is that we use municipal drinking water as the main source of irrigation. And a huge amount of our water goes to lawns in the country. And of course, that's water that has to be cleaned by the municipality, so that costs money, and then we're just using it to water the lawn. And we call that potable water, water that is of drinkable quality. So in a sustainable landscape, we try to capture and reuse rainwater and minimize the use of potable water. In general, in an unsustainable landscape, we try to make the plant fit the, sorry, we try to, sorry, in a sustainable landscape, the plants are adapted to the condition of the site. So we see what the site is, and then we pick the plants that go along with us, rather than sort of use water and fertilizers to make the plant fit to the site that we have. Okay, providing habitat. So this is more mountain mint that I just showed you. And so we think of, I think, butterflies and the importance of nectar and pollen. But we also want to talk about the caterpillar stage. This is a really important stage, and we want to be feeding our caterpillars in our gardens with native plants. So Doug Tallamy is the one who really made this information sort of at the popular level, which is that since no one wants to be eaten, plants don't want to be eaten, they manufacture toxins. And the only animals that can eat the plant are ones that have evolved with it for a long, long time. So these caterpillars have evolved here with these plants, and that means that they can process the toxins that these plants produce. And that's why you want to see things like this where the edges have been eaten by caterpillars. That's actually a good thing. We want to see that in our landscape. For years, what we had was a nursery trade that brought in plants from Asia and other places that wouldn't be eaten by the local insects. And anything else you want to say about that?
That's just the wrong way to handle it. Yeah. So, yeah, I specifically bought the one on the left so I could bring that caterpillar home. It's Baptisia, I think, and a clouded sulfur or something like that, butterfly, you know, so they're just beautiful. And the one on the right is the saddleback, and that is a stinging caterpillar. So you don't want to touch that. Yeah.
So along with caterpillars being good because they turn into butterflies, and that's part of the life cycle, butterflies and moths, they also are what feed our birds. So It turns out, and again, this is Doug Talamy's work, chickadee parents need to feed their young over 350 caterpillars per day. So we have to support the native plants that are supporting the caterpillars that are supporting the birds. And this is because the caterpillars can slide down the throats of the baby birds. So we think of like having berries and nuts and things, seeds in the garden for the birds, but this is also very important because you need to support the entire life cycle of wildlife that you want in your garden. So sometimes if you're not seeing birds, it might be because you're not supporting the this part of the life cycle. And just in general, a simple food web showing that the insects are here at the bottom, the energy comes in to the plants, and the only way for that sun's energy to get into the rest of the web of life is through insects. So insects are incredibly important. And then other critters eat the insects. So let's talk a little bit about native bees. So we have 400 native bees in Virginia, and some of them are endangered. We want to think about not only our butterflies and moths, but also there's flies and beetles and ants and wasps that also do pollinating. But the bees are incredibly important, and we don't want to mix those up with the honeybee, which is a different problem. The honeybees are having their problem. That's an agricultural problem, and they are non-native bees from Eurasia. And they also live in colonies, so they have a colony to defend, so they're more likely to sting you. A lot of these native bees of ours are solitary, so they just live by themselves, so they don't, they're not very likely to sting you.
Did you just say honeybees are not native?
They're not.
North America.
Yeah, they're not. And you know, somebody said to me, somebody said once, how do you think the squash plants were pollinated before the Europeans got here? Well, it was because there's a squash bee that pollinates the squash plants, because a lot of the native bees do a better job of pollinating than the honeybees do for certain crops like tomatoes and squash. Have you studied bees quite a bit?
A little bit. In one of my biology classes, I got really interested in some bees.
Really?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
There are a couple theories about how bees got here actually pretty early on by building hives in ships, like colonizing ships that came over and brought the bees over.
Really?
So they haven't been here for a long time, but no, they're not native.
Well, that's interesting. I have never heard that. Yeah.
And do most, I don't know, it's a question, but most bees don't make honey, right?
Right.
The honey.
Yeah, I think it's only the honeybees that make honey.
Right.
So-
Yeah.
So bees are basically for pollination of the plant. I mean, that's, well, you'll.
Yeah, and many wildflowers, for example, have very specific relationships, and the bees have very specific relationships with certain flowers. So this is where when one thing drops out of the landscape, you know, if you lose the bee, then there's nothing to pollinate that flower. Or if you lose that flower, then that bee has nothing to eat. So there's a lot of very specific relationships like that. Did you have any other questions?
What kind of bee is like, it's kind of like the middle one, but like really fat, nice and fat. They love our plants.
So maybe the bumblebees are furry?
Bumblebee, yeah.
Furry too?
It's fuzzy. And
Yeah, the bumblebees. So it's
Yeah.
really important to support the bumblebees.
I
That's
try to teach my kids that they're not gonna sting them.
Yeah.
I'm like, as big as they are, they're
not.
not gonna sting you.
Right.
I love bumblebees. They're
Right.
so
We tried to kind of make friends with one after seeing a video of a woman making a pet. of one.
real. Oh my
I think it
gosh.
was like honey water, or sugar water, I don't know, it was so cute.
Did that work for you and
So
your
then
kids?
My daughter's job loves them now, instead of being afraid of
Oh,
them.
that is
Fantastic.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So are bumblebees solitary as well?
I
They're
think,
ground nesters mostly, yeah, they're ground nesters.
yeah, do they
so
have
they're
any
solid.
social?
They have a little
network?
nest of their own that they tunnel in and take
Okay.
care of their little community,
Oh,
yeah. Mhm.
Now, the yellow jackets can be a bit of a problem, as
They are.
BJ found out.
I had 2 nests this summer. Yeah, one nest I had, I'm sorry to say, I couldn't take it. They were very violent and I had to take care of it. And I won't say how. And then the next one, it was like a month, 3 weeks ago, an animal had come by and dug it up. And there was a cylinder in the ground and it had taken out each of the discs of the yellow jackets
wow.
and taken care of them all. So I had like 5 discs laying around. It was amazing.
So
Yeah.
they're feeding wildlife, the
Yeah,
bees, yeah.
right. It was probably a raccoon or skunk. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not advocating you become friends with yellow jackets, but otherwise,
Yeah.
that mountain mint that we were showing you before, you know, you can just like, it's covered with bees in the summer of different kinds, and you could like run your hand right over the top of it, and they're not going to sting you. They're solitary bees, and 2, they're so busy doing their foraging that they're not thinking about stinging you. We want to support our bees throughout the season, from the very early things that come out, such as red buds and Virginia bluebells. They're early supporters of bees. And then in the fall, we have asters and goldenrod, because we want to support our bees like from March through November. In general, insects are on decline, and this is actually a really big problem. And that's just showing, the Lepidoptera is showing the butterflies and moths, that's the orange line, and then this is all other invertebrates are just declining over time. And you might not like bugs, but most of them don't bother us at all. Most of them are actually serving a purpose in the ecosystem. So this is actually a problem. We have this book for sale, and it's a great way to get.
Yeah.
Oh, we're giving them away. Wonderful. And yeah, it's a great way to get started with native plants and you can also find this online from Plant Nova Natives. They put this book together. Here's a place you can go to buy native plants. It's in Hamilton. BJ and I actually work there. And I'm only mentioning it because it's the only place in Loudoun County where you can go to buy.
And what's it called?
It's called Watermark Woods. So other places might have some native plants. We carry only native plants. And this is Julie Borneman. She's the owner. And as we were discussing a little bit before, you can get your home certified by Audubon at Home. So if you want some volunteer help with knowing what's in your yard and what you might want to need to get rid of in terms of invasives or what natives you might have, Audubon at Home will do that. And then you can buy a plaque if you want, which sort of lets your neighbors know what you're doing in your yard.
They'll come out as a service for free, right?
That's correct. It's free and we're volunteers. So it's not professional help, but it's good free volunteer help. So one more thing to cover is invasive plants. Did you study these? I bet you studied these.
I had a service project a while ago where we were just going through a massive garden getting rid of invasive plants. And
Oh,
some of them are kind of annoying.
yeah,
There are a lot of them.
yeah. Was that here in Ashburn?
It was around this area. I forget exactly where it was.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, invasive plants are a real problem, and if you have the time and energy to remove them from your property, that's a really good thing to do, or from wild areas on projects. And Loudoun Wildlife has some projects, and BJ actually runs a project to remove garlic mustard that you can read about in the latest Habitat Herald.
Centerfold.
Yes, yeah, it's in the centerfold, yeah.
Yeah.
So they did that at Ball's Bluff. At the very least, please don't buy any more invasive plants. They're still for, well, so here's a few. We can give you resources to find out more, but here we have Bradford pear. And we have burning bush, autumn olive, and the birds really spread these berries. English ivy, bittersweet, and barberry. And barberry is still widely planted in suburban homes, and you can see it now out in the forest. And this is this is the problem with invasive plants. It's not just something that is a problem in your own yard that people can say, well, I like that plant and keep it, but it's a problem for the wild areas, the forests and the meadows.
A lot of times they've been bred to be hardier, and so they kind of compete with
Yeah.
the native species, and the native species lose.
Mhm.
And so they're driving out into like even wilder areas.
The wind.
As they win.
I have Nanditas that I love, and I was afraid that.
They are one of the ones we don't,
Are they?
yeah,
The
we,
berries are actually toxic. If a bird eats too
Oh,
many,
yeah, the
it'll
kids
kill
look
it.
for those too.
Yeah, it has cyanide in it, right? So it can kill
Mm.
birds if they eat too
A
many.
lot of plants have cyanide.
Yeah. They
I'm
do.
gonna need y'all to come over.
Yeah.
yeah, so if you might want to think down the road about replacing the Nandina with
Yeah.
something else.
Like, since April.
Yeah, the Bradford pear is like the classic tree that every homeowner, builder, it's pops in the front yard.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, and they were actually bred and were, they were supposed to have been infertile. So they weren't supposed to get out of control like this. And then they went back and did some tweaking and ended up with a plant that was fertile. And it just got out
It's
of
really
control.
dangerous because as they grow and they get taller, their branches are kind of disproportionately heavy because I think they've been so genetically modified. And so you'll see like a lot of times these large branches broken off, but a lot of times it's in kids, front yards with their kids. And
Yeah,
Yeah, a lot of them on our street have fallen over since the 25 years we lived there. And they've been replaced with something else.
yeah.
The root system isn't very deep either.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
It goes far and wide. So we cut ours down.
But
And
then
then
you
it
get
comes
little
back
sprouts
up.
over
Yeah.
here and there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you go to Tuscarora High School in Leesburg,
Yeah.
you can see, I mean, it takes like 3 years before, it's everywhere, but it is a entire whole acreage of just Bradford pears. And when you walk in there, it's so depressing because that's all there is. And there's
Yeah.
nothing going on in there.
hmm
Yeah.
and it crowds out the native
Yeah.
plants.
Mhm.
So another thing we want to think about is gardening in layers. So for example, if you want to bring birds to your yard, you want to think about different stories. And this, actually, we have this over here on the table. We have this diagram just showing what birds come to the different stories in the forest. So in general, we want to think of plants as performing ecosystem services for us. And this is from an article Doug Tallamy wrote. Plants allow us and nearly every other species to eat sunlight. And they also produce oxygen, build topsoil and hold it in place, prevent floods, sequester carbon dioxide, buffer extreme weather, and clean our water. So now BJ is going to tell you a little bit about the garden here at Crossroads that she's worked really hard on and got a grant to put in a few years ago.
Yes, so this is a picture probably from last year after it was planted. We planted it in 2018. And so when we started the project, we won a Burke Grant for $1,500 to spend whatever we wanted for native plants. And so I came in on the project pretty easily, oh yeah, this will be fun. And so we walked out front and I think they were thinking that, we could just plant a few plants in there and not take up too much lawn. But, 7 years ago, I was the typical person that thought lawn was great and that's all I knew about. But, and I knew that we just needed to wipe this out and take the whole thing out, and everybody agreed with me. So, when you have the grass, as Nan said, it's not stabilizing the soil. It doesn't, its shallow roots means it's not infiltrating the water very well, and it's not supporting wildlife. So let's just wipe it all out and put in plants. And so with that project, I selected 32 different plants and 160 plants total for the project of $1,500 we had to spend. And so what was really fortunate and a blessing, I'd say, is that at that time, like 2 weeks before, Dominion Energy wrote Wild Wildlife Conservancy and said, we need a project for our team members to get involved in. I'm like, I've got the perfect place for them. So they came out on like September 19, 2018, and in a day just ripped everything out and planted everything. It would have been so much harder if they weren't there. Yeah, eternally grateful for them. Yeah. And so we ended up with all the nice plants and the leaf mulch too.
Yes, we use the leaf mulch.
Yeah. Right. So, it was very clay soil, and putting that leaf mulch in there immediately turned it into a nice organic area for it. And that's another picture of what it looked like after that. Probably the next spring, it started coming back up. Yeah. So within my planning, I knew I needed plants that took a lot of sun, could handle clay soil. But one of the biggest things on my list was I needed host plants. So we are all familiar with the bottom left, the milkweed for butterflies, for monarchs. So we planted butterfly weed, the orange one, in our garden out front, but there's also common milkweed and swamp milkweed that's available, but that wouldn't work for what we were doing.
There is common milkweed out there.
Out back. Yeah, that Mary planted years ago. Yeah. And so goldenrod is a plant for the typically is pollen and nectar for the fall, but that's also a host plant for 115 different types of caterpillars, and asters are at least 112 caterpillars it's a host plant for. And then the Carolina wild petunia is a host plant for beautiful buckeye butterfly. So that was some of my choices to put in there, along with weighing in, the heights of plants and things like that I was trying to keep in mind. So then just kind of giving a view of the different blooms of the season, where you got April with the phlox and everything's very quiet. And look, by May, it's just really shot up there. And I have golden Alexander in the front, that's the yellowish blooms. And that's a host plant for the black swallowtail caterpillar or butterfly. And so June is different blooms. There's the purple in the front is the wild petunia that I mentioned. And just the next one in July, you see the cone flower that's coming around to be the prominent bloom. And then August is black-eyed Susans. So all along this, you can see that it's getting more shelter for wildlife. Yeah. Some people around this time might start getting a little uncomfortable because they think it's a little messy. And that's what nature is, and that's what our lives are, is a little messy. So kind of, you got to let it go with that perfection and just know that it's providing a service for birds and wildlife there. But by the time September rolled around, I knew that I needed to start getting rid of some of those seed heads, because what we found from this project was, if the bird, you want to leave seed heads for the birds, but they're not going to eat all of them. So then the seeds drop to the ground, and then you have lots and lots of, plants that are popping up everywhere. So I had a little more control this year, trying to get rid of seed heads to have less competition for next year. So from those seeds that dropped, though, last year, we ended up having quite a bit of plants I was digging up. So Kathy and I worked with the community, and we had sharing the garden out there. So we'll be doing it again. It just it's a little work, but
Yeah,
yeah.
of course, then the pandemic came and there was no one to share the plants with.
Yeah.
and, So it got harder to do.
They did
but-
stop by. It was
Yeah,
like,
people did stop by and
yeah,
get some, yeah, but
right,
We're
yeah.
gonna be more intentional of that this coming spring and pass along some more plans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
I think that's a good marketing for it, doing
Sure.
that. So, yeah. And so we'll be doing that again. If we walk to the garden, we can talk about that sort of thing. Yeah. And so just transitioning to other yards that are in the community. one of our Audubon and Home certified yards was just a typical yard of grass, and that's the first phase where she hired somebody to help, and look what it turned into. Because we've got some beautiful pictures from her with monarchs and such on her plants. So that's what you can aspire to. And then our executive director didn't have a yard at that point. He was renting, and he chose to do a lot of container gardens. And I do that too. I have 3 acres, but that's okay. I love I love containers too. And so that's another way you can do it when you don't have much of a yard also. And then this is another yard in Countryside where they're in an HOA, but they have an agreement with them, I guess. It's very lush and full of Joe Pye weed and sunflowers for wildlife. So that's another way to handle your yard too.
So just to wrap it up, just a couple things you can do if you want to start really small is try leaving your leaves. They're important to feed the soil. They also are, we're finding out more and more that that's where a lot of insects overwinter. They say like ladybugs, for example, if you want to see more ladybugs, you have to have your leaves. I saw a post on Facebook the other day about the Luna moth and how the larval stage is in the leaves. So again, if you get rid of all your leaves, you're really taking away all those homes of some of those animals that we like to see. Think about reducing your lawn size, use native plants if you're going to be putting in new plants. Get a soil test before adding fertilizer if you do use fertilizer on your lawn. And don't buy non-native invasive plants. So thank you very much.
And for the people that are here, if they want to go tour the garden, we can walk through there.
And before the people that leave online, can you just get, I know Cheryl Moxley, but the other woman, so I can enter her in the tree giveaway?
Oh, I never made it back.
Oh,
That's
sure.
it, Cheryl.
It's just Cheryl?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And yep.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Bye, Cheryl.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And